Thank you all for coming tonight. It is my distinct honor and my pleasure to have quite an extraordinary speaker with us this evening, Ambassador Stu Eizenstat. Stu's career has been an exceptional one in terms of the positions and the breadth of work that he has done over a half century of diplomacy and domestic policy work. He was domestic policy advisor in the Carter administration at the White House. He has served at the Department of Commerce. He has served as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. If this sounds reminiscent of another significant fellow here at the Institute, it's very much similar to the arc of Jim Baker's career in terms of length and the variety of experience. He's had a diplomatic experience that has spanned these 5 decades in addition to his domestic work, and he has left a significant impact and an extraordinary legacy that affects work that we do today, that the United States does, that the international community does on a variety of issues. And those issues range from the Kyoto work on global warming, which continues to be a shaping event for policy, to the transatlantic agenda with the EU, where he was ambassador, to transatlantic business dialogue. He is, though, something else beyond a conventional diplomat and domestic policy advisor. Stu has done groundbreaking work for many, many years on the Holocaust and on Holocaust-related issues. It is not, I think, an exaggeration or flattery to say that the core of modern restitution, compensation arrangements for items taken from, stolen from, losses suffered by families, by heirs of those who perished in the Shoah, Stu was instrumental in establishing the frameworks to begin, albeit only partially, the compensation for what had taken place. And without his efforts, without your efforts, Stu, that would not have happened. So this is an inheritance and a legacy. And it goes on today. You can still find in the news at regular intervals continuing cases involving restitution, claims by heirs to retrieve, recover, and validate the stolen properties that they are entitled to. So this is not a historic issue. It's very much an issue of today. And we're going to be talking about these issues, about the Holocaust and its significance for today during the conversation that we're going to have. He is the expert advisor to the State Department on Holocaust issues. He is the envoy, as I was, on humanitarian issues in the Middle East. Stu remains and has served under, I believe, 5 presidents as envoy for Holocaust issues. So again, it is still something with which we, the government, we the American people, we the international community, very much need to be seized. But, Stu, you have written a book, The Art of Diplomacy, How American Negotiators Reached Historic Agreements That Changed the World, which has just been published, and there'll be copies for signing available outside after the event, and I hope you take advantage of that. And it's fitting that we look at some of the themes in that book. Secretary Baker contributed to the book by writing the preface and having an interview with Stu during its composition. So we'll talk about all of these things, and I think Stu may well have some questions for me, as I have just returned some days ago from my experience over much of the past year as Special Envoy for Gaza and Middle East humanitarian affairs. So please join me in a warm welcome to Rice and to the Baker Institute, again back to the Baker Institute, for Stu Eizenstat. Stu, I would normally start a conversation like this, since you have just had your book published, by turning to the themes in the book and trying to elicit from you what the principal takeaways are from the interviews you conducted and the work that you did. And we'll get to all of that. But I cannot, given circumstances that I have just left in Israel and in the Middle East, and the circumstances which you and I both, and which I think all of you here in the audience see today here at home on college campuses, the presence of what, not to mince words, is nothing short, in many cases, than raw anti-Semitic hate-mongering, masking itself as freedom of expression. There is that, but there's also something poisonous, venomous at play here. And I think there are lessons to be, once again, taken from this most recent experience on how do you deal with this pernicious phenomenon. How do you make the distinction between freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and pure vitriol and hatred? It's a tough one, but it's a distinction that has to be made, and it's an issue that has to be talked about. And I very much like your thoughts.
So first, David, I want to thank you so much for hosting this, for your kind introduction. This institute means an awful lot to me. I presented my book on President Carter here, and as you mentioned, Secretary Baker has been a longtime friend and mentor and wrote the preface. Now, on your question specifically, I wanted to see firsthand what was happening, and so I went up to New York early for the second Seder of Passover with my son to go to Columbia. And we were allowed to go in as a result of a professor of journalism who got us in. And there were a number of things that struck me about that where the line between free speech and actionable items is, to me, much clearer. The first is, all of the tents that I saw were identical and were expensive. And there was a food island in the middle that was well stocked. So one of the things we need to do, and I've said this in an interagency meeting in the White House a couple of days ago, is to trace the money. Where is it coming from? Second, these students, between 10 o'clock at night and 2 o'clock in the morning, use loud drums, bullhorns right next to the dorms to keep students from sleeping and studying. That is not free speech. That is interfering with the freedom of learning. And second thing that I did is I had a dialogue on Zoom with 6 Harvard Law School students. That's my alma mater. And I was shocked at the harassment that they found at Harvard Law School. For example, in the Wasserstein Social Hall, which is a place just for the students to go for coffee and a break, and the rules way before October 7 are it's a non-political space. Instead, it's been taken over by the pro-Palestinian groups. The administration does not move them out. Some of the professors harass them in class for supporting Israel. So this requires firmness by the administrations. It requires firmness by the administration in Washington and by all of our leaders to say free speech is valued. We want to have free expression, but we don't want you to go to a point of interfering with other people's ability to learn and to feel that they're in a space that is not a space of harassment. So I'm told by you that at Rice you've been able to navigate this. There are other places like Dartmouth which has done so as well. But the more you concede, the more space you give to students to take advantage. Columbia's now had to close and cancel its graduation ceremony, which is doubly a shame for these kids because as high school students, they didn't have a high school graduation because of COVID. So there is a firm line, and it's very important. Now, the other thing that's necessary, and this actually is going on, but it's not well advertised, and it needs to be, and that is Title VI civil rights cases against the universities that are bowing to this pressure. There are 130 open cases now by the Secretary. He was part of this interagency group that I met with. But that needs to be advertised so that we state that Jewish students are a protected minority, and harassment is a violation of Title VI, and the universities that tolerate it are subject to cutoff of federal funds. And that needs to be said up front.
So, Stu, I ask a question which sadly I have not heard posed as bluntly as I am going to do it right now, but it's an important one. What happened to common decency, to common sense, to a moral compass that encompasses both protections, avoidance of hate speech, and freedom of expression? Where did administrators go wrong, or is it much broader than that?
It's broader than that, because you could ask the same question about Washington. I mean, what's happened to Washington? Why do we have the kind of divisions in which, look, we've always had in our country, we had the Aaron Burr, assassinations and so forth, and we've always had very, very powerful political forces. But we've also had a sense that at the end of the day, the opposition was not the enemy. We've always found on big issues an ability to come together. And now the word compromise has become a dirty word. It's giving in to the enemy. So in a sense, Washington is setting a very poor example for these students. Second, students get their information in very different ways than you and I did when we grew up. They don't read newspapers. They don't watch the kinds of news channels that we do. And they get their information on social media and on cable. Cable is itself very different. So let's think about the time when we were growing up and you had ABC, NBC, and CBS, the Cronkites and Brinkleys and so forth. And yes, there were certain differences, but there was essentially a stable body of information. Now, Pat Moynihan once said, a great senator, he said, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. But we don't live in a universe of common facts. Mm-hmm. What you see on MSNBC, what you see on Fox, is a different universe. So that's taken even a step further by young people who don't even watch social media. They get it from TikTok, they get their information from Instagram, they get it from X, totally unfiltered, totally unvetted, and it creates a very negative environment. So I think it's a combination of the social media. It's also a combination of what we're seeing in Washington with the lack of civility, and that sets a very poor example.
So take that, what you've just said, and add, as we go back again to the theme that you've devoted so much of your life and career to, the Holocaust. Not just its consequences, but how it came to be. The America First isolationism, back turning to the world, to Europe, that took place in the 1920s, early 1930s here in the United States and elsewhere, and contrast and compare with the situation today.
So thank you. I gave a keynote speech this very week, May 7th, at the U.S. Capitol, for Days of Remembrance with the bipartisan leadership of Congress, and at least on this issue, there is bipartisanship. Speaker Johnson spoke, Democratic leader Jeffries spoke, the president spoke. The president appointed me as the chairman of the Holocaust Museum. Fred Zeidman was appointed in a previous administration. And here are the points I made, and here's the relevance to what's happened today. I said there really are a couple of questions. What would victims of the Holocaust think about what they're seeing in what we're seeing in the United States, about the rise of anti-Semitism, about Holocaust distortion and denial that we see on social media? What would they think is happening to the country that liberated the concentration camps and won the war. So there are three things that we should do. The first is there are still 245,000 Holocaust survivors around the world. We need to make sure they live in dignity. I've got a negotiation May 15th with the Germans to make sure we try to get as much home care and supplemental payments to the poorest of the poor. And by the way, of the 245,000, half are living in or near poverty, more than 90% in the former Soviet Union. In this country alone, 30% are living in or near poverty. So that's the first thing. The second is education on the lessons of the Holocaust, not just what happened, but what happens when intolerance and hatred go unchecked. But third, and most relevant to our international situation today, is this point. And this is a point I made in the Capitol and the one I want to drive home now. The Holocaust was not inevitable. Hitler's original goal was not the final solution. It was to make Germany Judenrein, free of Jews. He wanted the Jews out of Germany. And what did he see? And this has, again, shades of today. Number one, he saw in 1936, we didn't boycott the Berlin Olympics. In 1938, which was the decisive year, he saw no U.S. or world reaction, not even economic sanctions, when there was an Anschluss with Austria, when the Sudeten land was taken over, when the Avion Conference occurred in 1938, called by Roosevelt himself to deal with the German Jewish refugees, and no country lifted their immigration quotas. And Hitler said publicly, I'm willing to put the Jews on an ocean liner to get them out, and nobody wants them. Kristallnacht, the same year, 7,500 businesses, 1,000 synagogues, 30,000 Jews rounded up. FDR was asked immediately afterward, Mr. President, what is your reaction to Kristallnacht? And he said it was a terrible thing. And they said, what are you going to do? And he said, I'm referring it to the State Department. These were all signals that we were not willing to stand up to aggression. And had we done so, World War II wouldn't have happened. The Holocaust would have been substantially mitigated. And that has lessons for today. I'm very fearful that we're moving into an isolationist mentality here. We're exhausted from our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. You saw the difficulty of getting arms to Ukraine. And I told, by the way, Mike Johnson, as he came by after our ceremony, I said, Mr. Speaker, we're from different political parties, but I want to say this to you. If John Kennedy were writing a new chapter in his Profiles for Courage, you would be in it for taking on your caucus. But still, it took 6 months for that to happen. The counteroffensive would have been much more effective had we gotten those arms. I'm really concerned that we're moving into a 1930s type isolationism in which we learn the lessons of not acting against aggression, and we're sending messages to Xi in China, to Putin, that the U.S. doesn't have the will to stand up. And I can tell you, having been ambassador to the European Union, still spending a lot of time in Europe, with all the griping that Europe does, they desperately want our leadership. They want it in NATO, they want it with transatlantic relations with the EU. And if they see an inconstancy on our part, it will be absolutely a disaster. It will create a vacuum in this world, and as messy as the world is today, and God knows it is, it'll be infinitely worse because, like in physics, you know, there's a law of physics that nature abhors a vacuum, and so does politics. Somebody's going to fill that, and it will be filled by the Russians and the Chinese, and not by us.
And I'll add to that, over the course of the last 7 months of my envoy work, I've had the opportunity to travel to most capitals in the Gulf, the Levant, to Cairo. And I can assure you, for all of the complaint and objections and quibbles with U.S. policy, the broader Arab world, particularly the Gulf, is looking for our leadership and support as well. That hasn't changed. The fundamental calculus that an existential threat is posed by Iran today not just an Iran that might emerge with a nuclear weapon, but Iran today, both directly and with its proxies. That's a real and present danger. And it's a real and present danger which can be addressed, is being addressed in two different ways, very different ways. One is self-help. You turn to other parties that are able to provide weapons or support or assistance, or you reach an accommodation with Iran, or you do some combination of the two. But the preferred course to reduce the risk from Iran is association with the United States. And it happens to come at a moment when normalization with Israel pre-October 7th was very much in the interest for de-risking, for countering the Iranian threat, for associating with the U.S., the choice of a number of critical Arab states. And we continue as a strategic matter, not just to keep alive, but to actively pursue the potential for a Saudi-Israel-U.S. deal. And that deal, I can assure you, is still very much possible, very much on the cards. It will take certain steps, steps from us, steps from the Saudis, steps from Israel to implement, but it hasn't gone away because the strategic calculus that led to the motivation that drove the impetus for that deal is absolutely as strong, if not stronger today. If you need a demonstration of the Iranian challenge, not just to individual states, but to global shipping, through the Bab el-Mandeb up the Red Sea, look at the events of the last several months, the Houthi attacks on shipping, what that's done to global patterns of trade, including LNG, by the way, which has been significantly impacted by all of this. So the factors are there for U.S. leadership. Absolutely, they haven't gone away. And with all sympathy and understanding for the Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya experiences and what they produced psychologically, socially here, lost treasure, loss of lives, to what outcome? Construing what happened in those cases to the case of Ukraine is an extraordinarily wrong but also exceedingly dangerous phenomenon. Lessons are being drawn from Ukraine, and not just by Vladimir Putin, by Xi and by a number of lesser would-be authoritarians.
So, it's important to understand. Let's go back to 1994, and I mentioned this in my book. In 1994, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Ukraine became a fully independent country, something called the Budapest Memorandum was signed by Russia, by the United States, by our allies, and it essentially said, if you, Ukraine, give up your nuclear weapons, and they had a huge number, then we will ensure your borders are inviolable and your sovereignty will be protected. And we didn't follow through. 2014, the Crimea was taken. Then in 2014-15, there was something called the Minsk Agreements, which said essentially the same thing. And then here we have in 2022, the Russians again do it. So one of the things where there's an end game in Ukraine, if I'm sitting in the position of Zelensky and we're saying to him, look, we got this final package through Congress, we're not sure we'll get another one through. The best way to end this war is for Ukraine to be fully armed as quickly as possible with the strongest military assistance so that it can win back some of the territory. But at the end of the day, if there has to be some territorial division, it should be as little as possible, but it has to assure the Ukrainians and Russia that we're not going to back away again.
Exactly. And this is an issue whose consequences today and into the tomorrows goes far beyond Ukraine. Ukraine is important because there is a right and a wrong to all of this. But the projection beyond Ukraine to a failure, or what amounts to a failure, to stand up to this sort of vicious bullying and unilateral seizure of territory in Europe, on land, something we were not supposed to see in our lifetimes, again, has to be responded to. And if it isn't, we will pay All of us will. We'll pay in economic terms because there is a price for all of this, and we'll pay in geopolitical strategic terms. It's important, and it's not just the famous words of Chamberlain of faraway people of whom we know nothing. It's a people we know very much and whose interests are very much coincidental with our own in all of this. So let's turn, Stu, to the book. You go through a number of diplomatic examples of negotiations and diplomats, including Jim Baker, who were able to be successful, and you talk about them in terms of what they've done. So I'd ask you to summarize all of its style, circumstance, personality. What are the dominant factors that have led to success or not in negotiations as you draw out?
So I wrote the book for two reasons. The first reason was to show what American diplomacy can do to solve conflicts that seemed irresolvable, to make a better world. What factors are necessary? And second, a substantial part of the book looks at when should we use military force as an instrument of diplomacy. So I look at Vietnam, the two Balkan wars in Kosovo and Bosnia, the two Iraq wars under Bush I and Bush II, and the war in Libya, to draw lessons about when should we intervene and when should we not. And one of the things that I come away with, and Jim Baker is certainly the exemplar of this, is that you start in terms of the success of a negotiation with choosing the right negotiator. And that right negotiator, and Jim Baker is again a perfect example, has to have the following qualities. First, the person, man or woman, has to be willing to grasp the opportunity and have an absolute, utter determination to succeed. Second, he or she needs to be, as Bob Lighthizer, who was Trump's trade representative, said to me when I interviewed him, preparation, preparation, preparation. You have to know more about your brief than anybody else at the negotiating table, so you know how and when to compromise. Third, and this is something that is not universally understood, it's the ability to listen to the other side and put yourself in their position. This is not a game of poker where it's winner take all. You can't have a successful negotiation unless both sides see that it's a winning situation. And you have to be able to craft your position in such a way to make them think that what they've agreed to is in their interest when it's also in yours. It has to be a win-win situation. Additional factors that go into choosing the right person is sheer stamina. There is no negotiation of any consequence that doesn't go on weeks on end, months on end, sometimes years on end, and always seems to end at 3 o'clock in the morning on the last day. And you have to be able to keep your head clear. You have to go on 2 or 3 hours sleep. I mean, Kissinger coined the phrase shuttle diplomacy by spending a month going from one capital to another with almost no sleep. Jimmy Carter, during 13 days and nights at Camp David, got maybe 3 hours sleep. When I was doing Kyoto, for 5 straight days, we got maybe 3 hours sleep. Jim Baker, when he was doing German reunification. So you have to have stamina. And the other is something that's not necessarily the case in a commercial negotiation. When you're doing a business deal, I don't want to use the art of the deal. When you're doing a business deal, it's generally about money, and you're not going to have an ongoing relationship with that individual. If it doesn't work, you back away, you go to another deal. That's not the case. You're dealing with sovereign countries who you need for the next deal. And so you need to develop a personal relationship, and here with the other side, and here's where Jim Baker was absolutely brilliant. So I have one chapter on German reunification. The wall falls. Nobody expected it. Nobody expected the Berlin Wall to fall. And now what do? Well, Kohl wanted, the chancellor, to reunite East and West Germany. Seems reasonable from his standpoint, but the Allies, the French, the Russians, and the UK were very afraid of a reunited Germany.
You remember Margaret Thatcher?
Margaret Thatcher made
Her
the famous
phrase.
statement that I love Germany so much I want two of them. So Jim Baker had the task first of convincing our own allies that it was in their interest to have a reunited Germany, that a Germany united floating in the middle of Europe was dangerous. And he had to convince them, in addition, that it should, and this was really the tough position for the Russians, that it should be a united Germany in NATO, within NATO. That was a huge mountain to climb. And one of the ways he did it was developing with the Russian foreign minister, at that time still the Soviet foreign minister, Shevardnadze, a personal relationship. And how did he do that? Well, this is what you have to learn again in international negotiations. You need a personal touch. And so he took Shevardnadze on a plane to Jackson Hole, and he spent 3 days in Jackson Hole talking about family, and Shevardnadze said, you know, the mountains here in Jackson Hole remind me of my native Georgia, and they developed a relationship that was absolutely crucial. And Shevardnadze, in the end, overcame the objection of his own foreign ministry because he had confidence in Baker. So having trust is important, and then one last factor is having the confidence of the president. If the other side thinks that you don't have the full confidence of the president, then you can't negotiate. And Baker said to me, no one could get between me and George H.W. Bush. I had been his campaign manager. They knew how close we was. And no one doubted that when I spoke for the president.
And Stu, I have worked for every president since Jimmy Carter, and I have never seen the relationship you just described as it was with Baker and Bush 41. I have seen presidents act as their own secretaries of state and national security advisors brilliantly, but it discredits and disables their secretaries and their national security advisors. And I've seen halfway measures of the two. This would be, in my view, flaming letters of how you succeed.
And interestingly, I interviewed Kissinger twice, and at 99 plus, he wrote the foreword to my book, and I've said, if no one wants to read my book, they should at least read his essay, because it's one of the last things he wrote before he died. And he said, because, you know, the whole relationship between President Nixon and Kissinger was always in question. He said, I could not have done what I did unless I had the full confidence of the president.
Let's talk just a moment about Dr. Kissinger. We've had Martin here, Martin Indyk, speaking about his book, analyzing Kissinger's Middle East negotiations.
It's a wonderful book.
A master of the game. And it makes some very interesting judgments that Kissinger was fundamentally a Westphalian. He was shaped by a diplomatic history in which you went for the maximum degree of stability, for the maximum amount of time you thought you could achieve. You don't go for the grand goals, because if you do, you more often than not fail and you destabilize your situation. What do you think as you assess his record?
So I think Kissinger gave me a number of insights. One is the fact that if you shoot for a home run, you're more likely to strike out. You want to go for singles and build confidence. And that's one of the things we're going to have to do in the Middle East.
Yes.
Now, Carter learned a very tough lesson. When he first came into office, he proposed a comprehensive settlement, getting the Geneva Conference back, getting all 22 Arab countries together with Israel and trying to resolve everything. Lebanon, Syria, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, Palestinians, and it failed. And I believe the reason that Sadat made his historic trip to Jerusalem was he realized that if he had to be part of a 22 Arab state thing where all these issues are on the table, he would never get the Sinai back. I absolutely believe that's the reason he made the trip to Jerusalem and said no more wars. Then Carter came back down to earth and realized that he had to go for singles. So the Palestinians weren't even at Camp David because they wouldn't accept UN Resolution 242, Land for Peace. And we came up with this sort of very vague thing about full autonomy. So this was really absorbing, because the other thing about Kissinger, which I mentioned in his opening to China with Zhou Enlai, is he said that when he first met Zhou Enlai, who was the premier of China, was number 2 to Mao, and the real brains behind the whole operation, he wanted to get immediately to the big issues. And Zhou said, no, I want to show you around, I want to show you the Forbidden City, I want to show you the culture. And he realized that when you negotiate, you can't always negotiate with an American mentality. You have to look at the culture, the history, and the politics of your opponent. You have to understand where they're coming from. You have to build confidence based on the way they look at the world. And that's one of the reasons why he was ultimately successful, because he did understand. And he was a Europeanist. He had to do a lot of homework on China. Mm-hmm. And he did. And so that was really also very vital, is understanding the culture and the history. And one of the things I mentioned in the military part of the book, when you look at the lessons of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, is we did not know the culture and history of those countries. You served in those countries. We didn't understand them. We intervened in countries and tried to make them into Western democracies when they had no history of that. And we tried for too much. It's one thing to defeat the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. It's another thing to try to create in Afghanistan a Western-style democracy, and the same with Iraq. So you have to be very circumscribed in what you do, and you have to understand the culture of the country. Iraq, too, again, I say this, that Secretary Baker really served George H.W. Bush, that George W. Bush didn't understand many of the lessons that George H.W. Bush, his father, had. When, in the first Iraq war, called the Gulf War, after Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, he had very limited political goals, Bush did, just to get them out of Kuwait and basically nothing more. And he and Colin Powell were brutally criticized. Yeah. You've got Saddam on the run, why don't you grab him by the neck? And Colin Powell says, if we occupy Baghdad, we'll own it. And we don't want to own it. So that was a lesson that Kissinger knew. Again, don't go for more than you can grasp. Baker understood that. Bush 1 understood it, Bush 2 didn't.
China, from your commerce, treasury, domestic policy, and now diplomatic historian perspectives, what's the approach you take?
So let me tell you a funny anecdote about China. Kissinger and Nixon deserve all the credit in the world for the opening to China. It was historic and very courageous. I mean, one of the attributes, by the way, of a great negotiator is courage, being willing to take your base on. And the Republican base was very much against the opening, so they deserve the credit. But they didn't normalize diplomatic relations with China because the Taiwan lobby within the Republican Party was too strong. We did in Carter. And here's the anecdote. Deng Xiaoping comes over, all 4'11" of them, and I remember seeing him and saying, how does this little guy control 1 billion Chinese? And he first came to Texas, and they put a cowboy hat on him, which looked like it was a dress that covered almost his entire body. So he finally comes to the White House, and I was in the cabinet room for the first meeting, and he says to the president, through a translator, of course, Mr. President, I appreciate that you've established diplomatic relations. It's really historic. It hasn't happened since the end of World War II. But what I really need to build up the Chinese economy is something called most favored nation treatment, meaning that Chinese goods would get the lowest tariffs that we extend to our allies. That will really help our economy. Now I know, says Doug, that there is a barrier to that in something called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. But he said that was aimed at the Soviet Union because they restrict emigration of Soviet Jews. Now he says, Mr. President, we have no restriction on the number of Chinese who can leave China. And he takes the little White House paper, White House, Washington. He pushes it over to Carter with a pencil, and he says, now, Mr. President, write on this piece of paper the number of Chinese you'd like us to send you each year. 1 million, 10 million, 20 million? And Carter says, I'll tell you what, we'll make a deal right now. I'll take 10 million Chinese a year if you'll take 10,000 American journalists. Now, what's happened with China is that since Deng modernized and opened China, and they had, by the way, an almost unbelievable economic success. I mean, they have lifted hundreds of millions of people into the middle class. What's happened now, however, with Xi is really a retrograde policy, much more authoritarian, much more against the private sector, making it much more difficult to do business in China, much more money for the state-owned enterprises. This is going to hurt China. And one of the things that's important when we think about this big bugaboo of China, China now has 1.2 billion people. By the end of this century, they'll have 750 million. Their population will be cut in half. Their one-child policy is tremendously detrimental, so that they're not going to be the power necessarily at the end of this century than they are now. But we need to stand up very clearly to China, and I'll give you again a personal anecdote. I was on the Defense Policy Board advising the Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration. Kissinger was on that as well, and China has done the following. There are 3 little coral reefs in the South China Sea, and they have built them into full military bases so the aircraft can land, and then they claim jurisdiction of 14 nautical miles around those. So as one of the briefers from the CIA told us, they think of the South China Sea as the Great Lakes in the United States, like it's theirs. So we recommended to Obama, and he carried it out, and Trump carried it out, and Obama's carried it out, that we do not allow them to do that. We take our warships right by those islands. So you've got to be forceful in dealing with China as well. And the same thing in terms of protecting Taiwan. You've got to project an image of strength, or China will take huge advantage of us.
It's not a gotcha moment, but I ask all of our guests who talk to these topics, ambiguity or clarity with respect to the straits in Taiwan?
Well, this is going to sound strange. We need both, and by both I mean this. Clarity in terms of the fact that the South China Sea is international, that they agreed in the Shanghai Communique with Kissinger and Nixon that Taiwan would be resolved peacefully. That is in the communique. And we intend that they have to abide by that. Ambiguity in terms of what happens if they end up taking military action. We've never said we will necessarily go to Taiwan's defense. We've provided military arms, and we need to have enough ambiguity so they think we might, but we don't overcommit ourselves.
Same position, by the way, that virtually everyone I've spoken to here has reiterated. That careful balance between clarity of commitments, but ambiguity on how the response would come. So we turn now to the vexed Middle East, where we have both spent time dealing. You talked about use of military force, and a critical point is if you're going to use military force, you need to know what your objectives are. You need to understand how you can assess in a cold-eyed fashion whether you're meeting your objectives or not, and what you do to pivot or adjust if you're failing to meet the objectives. And you've got to track it constantly. There can't be an automatic pilot. And I think you speak to this in the book as well. So I'll ask you your thoughts. and then I'll offer my own on the present situation.
So Steve Hadley, who I interviewed twice, who was Bush II's national security advisor, said the following: when you look at military force, you have to ask before the first bullet is fired, before the first bullet is fired, not while you're in the middle of the conflict. Where do we want to end up? Then you work backward, he said, all the way to your initial military plan, and if you feel you can't leave behind a stable situation consistent with your vital interest, you shouldn't go to war to begin with. So here, with respect to the Gaza war, and we sent generals over after October 7th to say, look, this is your 9/11 situation. And we jumped too quickly with Afghanistan. We needed to think about where do we want to end up. Don't make the same mistake. Know what the end game is. What is the post-war government of Gaza going to look like? How are you going to deal with the civilian situation? None of those questions were really answered before their first bullet was fired, and they still haven't been answered.
I was with the president on the 18th and 19th of October when he traveled to Israel. And the president, privately and in his broader comments, said, don't make the mistake that we did after 9/11. We were driven too much by a sense of overreach, of vengeance. Rightfully so. We had lost a significant number of innocents to the terrible events that took place on 9/11. And Israel's national trauma after October 7th was and remains quite powerful, I can assure you, having lived there for the last 7 months. It's potent. You feel it everywhere. But the president's counsel was, think through what you do. Don't do what we did and act in an emotional fashion. Now, that's perhaps easier counsel given than counsel to take when you have been, as a country, as a society, traumatized in the way Israel was. But still.
I agree. I've gone to Israel probably 50 times, and I chair a think tank with Dennis Ross based in Jerusalem. October 7th had an even more traumatic effect on the psyche of Israelis than 9/11 did on ours. Now, we all know that we live in a very different world than pre-9/11. I mean, go to any airport where we have to go through metal detectors, and you certainly know that. We know that from the Afghan war and the like. But we are a country of 330 million people. Israel is a country of 9 million people. And virtually every person in Israel knows someone directly or indirectly who was either killed or taken hostage. And it's had a dramatic psychological effect in the following way. Number one, before October 7th, in every poll for decades, over 65% of Israelis supported a two-state solution. One for Palestinians, one for Israelis. There was a question of borders and security, but the concept, today that's 25%. And even the left is very doubtful about it. So you've got that. And second is the dilemma of how do you deal with an existential threat at your border. So Hamas is an existential threat. One of the things I mentioned in my book, you can have the greatest negotiator who has all the criteria that I've just mentioned. If the parties don't want an agreement, if their narratives are too far apart. Now, here was the great, in my opinion, greatest mistake that was made by the Prime Minister. Yes, there was a mistake in several respects. First, for 2 years, Hamas transformed itself from being a terrorist group, which would send individuals in from time to time to Israel. They'd kill a few people. They, in turn, would be captured or killed, into a terrorist army. That's what several of the generals who briefed us said.
30,000 strong.
30,000 strong, organized by battalions, heavily armed, not throwing Molotov cocktails with the most sophisticated weapons. This happened right under the nose of the Israelis. So that was, but the strategic mistake, which was so unnecessary, is that for all of the faults of the Palestinian Authority, and I know them, I've been to the Middle East. During the Clinton administration, I spent half a dozen times negotiating directly with Arafat between 97 and 2000. They're weak, yes, but they signed the Oslo Accord. They're willing to have a two-state solution. But the prime minister weakened them, held back their tax money, didn't give them money for salaries and for paying their police, and allowed Qatar to spend $500 million building up Hamas because he didn't want a two-state solution. So this was a disastrous strategic decision. Now, what we have in Israel today is an oddity that I have never seen. That is, right and left, there's a desire, according to the polls, for, I mean, this is not my judgment, I'm just giving you the polls, for the prime minister to no longer continue. Now, I think it was a mistake, and I'll say so now, for Schumer to say that. We should never involve ourselves in that dimension in an internal fight, certainly with an ally. But having said that, while the polls show that they want a new prime minister, they basically support his war aims. They want Hamas eliminated. They feel that living next door to Hamas is an impossible situation. And you can't negotiate. You can negotiate with the Palestinian Authority. You can't negotiate with Hamas. Maybe you can on a ceasefire, but not on a peace agreement.
Even on that.
Well, you've seen that. So
it's not been
maybe
successful.
We should turn to you, and you've just come back. What do you see now, David?
This is a conflict unlike any that the State of Israel has ever been engaged in. There is no comparison to 73 and the surprise of 73. That was a conflict with states. And you could work with the states. There were finite objectives that you could discern and you could work
and no
through.
Civilian casualties.
And no civilian casualties. It was all military. This is very different. The magnitude of the Hamas, and you use exactly the right phrase, terrorist army, military, not gangs, was well beyond anything either Israel or we assessed. The magnitude of the hundreds of kilometers of strategic tunnels, deep tunnels.
Some 80 meters deep. Now, can you imagine building you're cheek to jaw with Israel, and you're able to build a tunnel that's 80 meters deep?
It is where so much of the assistance that went into Gaza was destined for. And these are not primitive hand-hewn tunnels. These are very sophisticated, very hardened tunnels, well beyond anything Saddam had in Iraq, which we were able to damage. This is another thing altogether, and it was a surprise, and they're everywhere. This is a tough fight. So what are the objectives? The objectives, the real objectives, strategic objectives Israel's articulated, which we agree with, is the disruption, the diminution of Hamas's ability to do two things. One is to ever threaten Israel again, as it did on October 7th. The other objective, and the much harder one to achieve, is that Hamas cannot be left at the end of all of this in a position either to assert governance over the people of Gaza or to deny, passively or actively, governance to anybody else, whether the anybody else are PA, Arab coalitions, anyone else. That is a hard thing to do. Israel has re-entered northern Gaza now, I believe, 5 times. They're there right now in Zaytun and Jabalia, fighting Hamas, coherent fighting units of Hamas. It's been diminished, absolutely. It's been degraded, no question about that at all, but it is still highly effective, which leads us to the question where all of us seized, and the press are seized with today, of Rafah. What would be the cost of a ground maneuver entry into Rafah, where you have somewhere between 1.1, 1.3 million people who have been displaced multiple times from everywhere else in Gaza, densely packed into this one small area. What's going to be the humanitarian impact of forcing them out because they would have to go and conducting a campaign, vice what you would gain from a campaign? The gain is you further diminish, you further degrade what remains of Hamas's intact units. But what's the calculus? What's the price? And above all, what's the strategic objective? Has it been worked through all the way? This is a tough one. It's a very tough one indeed. I'm asked all the time, well, what's the day after look like? And I tell people my mission is to get to a day before that permits contemplation of a day after that looks different from the Hamas governance of 2007 to October of 2023. And that's a hard objective.
Let me tell you how much has changed. So let me take you back, not light years, July of 2000. So I was in charge of the economic dimension of the peace process. Dennis Ross did the political. And I went to Gaza in July of 2000. And we got the Congress to pass a law, which is still on the books, called qualifying industrial zones, which meant that if you had as little as 10% content in a product made in a country like Egypt or Jordan or the Palestinian territories that had a peace agreement with Israel, you could ship back to the United States duty-free. And here's what I saw. In Gaza, I saw 30 plants employing 1,200 Gazans, with the foundations for another 30 being laid. I saw one unarmed Israeli soldier watching the products being loaded onto a flatbed truck and going through the Eretz crossing to the airport that we got the Corps of Engineers to build. It was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And when I saw Arafat right afterward, I said, this is terrific. What happened? The second Intifada happened.
Yes.
Right after the failure of Camp David II. 2005, Prime Minister Sharon, and I wish I could say this to the kids who are demonstrating all over the campuses. 2005, Prime Minister Sharon, who was a hardliner, Fred, he was a hardline prime minister. He pulls all the Israeli Defense Forces out of Gaza, every last one. He uproots 7,000 Israeli civilian settlers, and he leaves in place all the infrastructure, the greenhouses, the light industry, so that when the Palestinians take over Gaza, they have an infrastructure. They then have an election, and all elections are not good in some places, and Hamas wins the election, and what do? They tear all of the infrastructure down, and they start sending, now I'm not talking about October 7th, I'm talking about 2007. They start sending rockets over.
They overthrow the PA.
They overthrow
and they expelled the PA. And I'll add to that, Ariel Sharon. In 2006, I sat at the desk in Steve Hadley's office, and with Sharon's team, we wrote a letter from Sharon to the president, and a letter from the president back to Sharon. That letter, and it wasn't all that long, that letter laid the groundwork for a Palestinian state with definable borders, which would have entailed the withdrawal of significant numbers of Israeli settlers, the Ariel fingernails, as we called them, the progressive penetration into the West Bank like a finger. That would have been largely evacuated, and Sharon was prepared to do that. But his cerebral hemorrhage came, and then the Obama administration decided they did not wish to recognize the exchange of texts, and an opportunity
I've
lost.
said that we had 3 Israeli prime ministers who had the confidence of the public and who had the capability of reaching an agreement. One, Rabin, who I knew very, very well, was assassinated. The second, Sharon, had a stroke. And the third, Omer, who offered Abbas, the current president, in 2009, 96% of the West Bank. And in Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, it was turned down, and he was indicted.
Yeah.
So, assassination, stroke, indictment.
We've got a couple questions, which I will try to take. Someone writes, been frustrated on the obsession with ceasefire in Gaza. Is there a diplomatic effort to relocate Gazans to neighboring countries where they could have better lives and escape the thumb of Hamas? And the answer there is a very clear one. It's the U.S. answer. It's also the government of Israel's answer. The future of the people of Gaza has to be in Gaza, not elsewhere, and certainly not in Egypt.
I mean, my partner Marion Lewin and I were in Egypt after October 7th, and we met with ministers and former ministers. They were deadly afraid that the Israeli policy was going to be to push the Gazans into Egypt. Now, there are a couple of the right-wing ministers who said that, but the prime minister has not. It's not their policy. And yet, they're deadly afraid that the overwash of Rafah will be, and this would play into Hamas's hands, would be to see Gaza.
2004, Hamas pushed out about 110,000 Palestinians into North Sinai. They made it almost to the canal. It took almost a year to round them up. And some of them went into what was then an al-Qaeda-style group, Ansar Beit al-Muqdis, which then transformed itself into ISIS Sinai. The Egyptians are not going to take that risk. And they're very worried today, as we speak, that a Rafah operation, however carefully confined by space and intensity, would be a pretext for Hamas to breach the border wall, where you have hundreds of thousands of displaced right up against the fence, and put them in as a complicating factor for all of this. So the intensity of the Egyptian view is by no means eased from your experience. It is as intense, as absolute as it was back then. But here's a question for you. What are your thoughts on the president's expression and demonstration of support for Israel, but his CNN comments then elaborated on by the White House yesterday with respect to withholding of arms should Israel undertake a full-blown maneuver into Rafah?
Well, I have to make this off the record, this part, but I will answer it directly, but this part has to be off the record.
I also have to be constrained in my own comment on this, but I will note an extraordinary joining of traditional left and right pro and anti-Netanyahu elements in Israel in expressing very serious concern over this statement. It has not elicited broad sectors of support from within Israel, even from, to use a shorthand, the Haaretz constituency.
But having said that, I mean, the president does deserve tremendous credit overall for really sticking with Israel over a lot of political opposition within his own
You called
party.
him, and I will, in this case, not flatter my boss by noting, he's a mensch.
Yes.
He has stood up to enormous criticism from his own classic constituencies. And that takes huge courage to do. You can stand up to your enemies, standing up to your friends with what he thinks is right, and it is not driven by calculation. I can tell you, having sat with him, listened to him speak, he believes it. He believes it in the core of his being, but he is very concerned with where this is going and the answer to Dave Petraeus's famous question, tell me how this ends. Ends to the benefit of Israel, ends to the benefit of the region, ends to the benefit of the United States. And look, I'll repeat an inconvenient truth here. No Arab government wants to see Hamas emerge as the victor. Israel has to win All Hamas has to do is survive. And that's Sinwar's calculation. He can survive. And if he survives, then he presents himself as the exemplar, as the model, the champion of the resistance, not just in Gaza. Gaza's the instrument. And not just in Ramallah and the West Bank. That's the next target. But in the Gulf and throughout the Arab world. And I assure you the consequences for the United States of that kind of strategic paradigm being set is going to be extremely bad, because it isn't just Hamas. Hamas instrumentalizes, or tries, Iran and Iran's proxies. Iran also instrumentalizes Hamas and what it does. You magnify the already potent challenge, strategic challenge, posed by Tehran with that kind of outcome. Stakes are very, very high in all of this.
Yeah, I mean, let me say clearly, along with David, Hamas cannot win this war. It is not possible. It's not right for Israel's security to have to live cheek to jaw with a group that is so well armed and wants to destroy the state, not negotiate a two-state solution. The president understands that. I think he supports that goal. But let's also remember that for weeks on end, the president asked the prime minister, if you're going to go into Rafah, give me a plan to move those million refugees, internal refugees who came from the north, at your request, out of the battlefield, and that hasn't been done.
No, I have reviewed countless hours the humanitarian plan. And it's a serious plan, but it's not adequate. It makes assumptions and assertions about timelines, about capacities to provide humanitarian support, to provide housing, and we simply do not believe those assumptions are accurate.
So David, tell us, because this is your mandate from the president, and you're in the region now very frequently and recently.
But hopefully not again.
What is the humanitarian situation today? Has it been improved? The Israelis have opened new
Sure.
Avenues.
I have to start the answer to that question with looking at where we were on October 18th when the president came to Israel. Not one drop of fuel, not one drop of water, not 1 ounce of food is going to move in until our hostages are free and Hamas is eliminated. That was the 18th of October. 21st of October, the first trucks of humanitarian assistance began moving. Shortly after that, the first fuel began moving in. There has been a progressive, slow, inadequate to need, but a progressive improvement in the situation, and that improvement has taken off in the months of March and April, particularly after the president's April 4th phone call with Netanyahu on steroids. We have multiple land corridors now open, so-called Gate 96 into the central corridor. Erez crossing, which we were told would never reopen again. It was the site of some of the killings that took place by Hamas at the crossing in the facility. That's open again. The Jordan corridor, trucks moving directly from Jordan, inspected near Amman, across the bridge, up by land, and in through Erez or in through Kerem Shalom. All of that has happened. Kerem Shalom has dramatically increased its capacity for inspections to the point that we were getting 400 plus trucks a day and 100 plus trucks into the north, all of which had the impact by beginning of May of mitigating, as long as the assistance flowed, the extreme risk of famine and preventing actual famine from occurring. But we said clearly that's not good enough. Just preventing famine isn't an adequate response to the humanitarian situation. Sanitation, disease, chronic wasting, massive malnutrition, widespread malnutrition. The indicators of disease, which in hot summer weather now upon us there, it could become real. All of these dictated a much more strategic approach. Don't count trucks anymore, I used to tell folks. Count what's going in. What kind of specialized feeding is moving? What kind of specialized medications are going? Fresh food, not just ready-to-eat meals and dry food. cooking oil, cooking gas, the things people need for more balanced nutrition. That's where we were in the process of moving until the interruption of this limited Rafah campaign. Kerem Shalom, the major entry point, is still open, so is Erez, but there is a logistical challenge in moving Egyptian trucks through Kerem Shalom into Gaza, while Rafah, the international Egypt-Gaza crossing, is closed. And Rafah was, in the Israeli plan, always going to be closed for 10 days to 2 weeks in the midst of all this. So we are focused right now on getting Rafah itself opened again. The Israelis are saying we're clearing. We got to see what's under and what's around Rafah before we resume, including tunnels into the Sinai. It needs to reopen. We need to get the thousands of trucks that are sitting in the Sinai, waiting to move in, to be inspected and to move in as rapidly as possible. But something else is needed as well. The government of Israel needs to exert its sovereign authority over the demonstrators who have violently assaulted Jordanian drivers, Jordanian trucks, attempting to move humanitarian assistance at the request of the government of Israel into Gaza. This kind of lawlessness needs to be addressed. It is the responsibility of every state worthy of the name to impose its will on its own citizens, not just on those from outside. And this has got to be done as well.
So let me take this into a broader context and back in effect in the book. I mean, I wrote the book because I wanted to show what active U.S. engagement and diplomacy can do to solve seemingly irresolvable problems. And what I think we need to do here is the following. First, we need to have a special envoy, and David would be a perfect one, to actually have the broader jurisdiction, not only humanitarian aid, but to try to solve the following situation. We're facing a classic situation in which Iran has created what they call an axis of resistance with themselves, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, and Hamas, supported now by the Russians and to some extent by the Chinese. We have the opportunity with the right diplomacy, the right leverage, the right incentives to create an opposing positive incentive. We've got peace agreements already between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan. We have the Abraham Accords, which President Trump deserves credit for negotiating with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan. We have the prospect that David mentioned earlier of a normalization with the Saudis, which would be transformative. What we've got to do is get past this Gaza situation so that we can put together this broader coalition. It will take time, but it is in the absolute interest of our own country and of Israel and of the region that we have a counter group to the axis of resistance.
You cannot fight an idea with bullets. You can only fight it with another idea. And while I do not have a magic wand to wave on creating that day after, I can tell you what a sine qua non of any solution is going to be, and it is a clear pathway to an agreed, negotiated two-state outcome. Hard as that is to contemplate right now, and it is hard, and your quotes about the percentage of Israelis supporting that idea are absolutely spot on. But it's got to be held out there. If you do not have a political horizon which contemplates two peoples, two states living in peace with each other under mutually agreed conditions and terms. Go back to Bibi's 2009 Bar-Ilan speech, in which he accepted that premise. If you don't have that, then Hamas's political horizon, or others like Hamas, are going to shape the future. And that, folks, would be a disaster for all the people of the Middle East as well as for the United States.
To pull together Ukraine and Gaza, I'll quote Henry Kissinger in his interview with me. And he said, "You can't win at the negotiating table what you don't win on the battlefield." So we've got to put Ukraine in a position where it is as strong as possible when it goes into negotiations. We have to put Israel in a position as strong as possible, denigrating Hamas, so that it is in the strongest position. And we have to have that political horizon. And right now the public opinion is certainly against a two-state solution, but it is the only solution. And ultimately, I think if we can get past Gaza and have a satisfactory solution there, you'll start to see public opinion come back if they realize that the alternative is so positive in terms of the Saudis and a normalized situation in which they're really integrated into the whole region. You know, let me give you a figure. This is very interesting. We've had a peace agreement with Egypt, which is held, but it's a cold peace, since 1979. Last year, 2023, the trade between Israel and Egypt, which is a country of 100 million people, was $300 million. I mean, that's like nothing. The trade between Israel and the UAE, where the Abraham Accords are only 3 years old, which is a country of 9 million, is $2 billion. And with the Saudis, it would be infinitely greater. And that would make a more prosperous, more peaceful Middle East.
Absolutely, Stu. That vision is out there, and our common friend Tom Friedman has written Rafah or Riyadh. Now, that is, and Tom would admit, a simplification of issues. But there is a choice here, and it's a hard choice. I do not in any way render it less complex than it really is. It's tough, but it is a choice.
Let me conclude. I don't want to take people's time unnecessarily, but I'm willing to stay as long as you want. Let me take Northern Ireland. I have a whole chapter on the Good Friday Agreement. There was a 100-year dispute over whether Northern Ireland should be part of the Irish Republic or part of Great Britain. And the last 20 years, in what I call classic British understatement, they called it the Civil War between the Catholics and the Protestants, the Troubles. I mean, the Troubles ended up killing 3,500 people and maiming 10,000. It was a horrific civil war. But there, the key thing was courage. And it's not courage on the battlefield. It is the courage of the Catholic leaders, the courage of the Protestant leaders who said, enough is enough. We've got to come to terms. We've got to find a way to live together. George Mitchell did an incredible job of negotiating. Bill Clinton was courageous in granting the head of Jerry Adams, the head of the Sinn Féin, a visa over opposition. You need courage, courage, and courage if you're going to take these issues on. And that has to be present on the Israeli side, on the Arab side, on the U.S. side.
All true. But Hamas has had the choice for 31 years to agree to what was once called the Oslo Principles, then the Quartet Principles, to eschew violence and follow a peaceful negotiated course to a resolution with Israel. Had they chosen that, we'd have a very different history of the last 15 to 20 years.
And
they will not do it, not because they pretend to have a different policy. Their ideology and their political ambitions are in a very different direction entirely. And their declaration that they would repeat October 7th again and again and again needs to be taken as seriously as possible. You must degrade their ability to oppose any other vision, any other political horizon, or you will get to some form of restoration of the miserable situation of 2007 to October 7th of last year.
You know, we can end with what we started. We talked about the campuses at the beginning.
Yes.
It's so frustrating that these kids don't understand where Hamas is coming from. When they say from the river to the sea, that means the extinction of Israel. To support a terrorist group is just unacceptable. And somehow we've got to be able to reach these students and educate them about the history, that there was a two-state solution created in 1947 by the UN. Israel accepted the partition of the British, the Arabs didn't, and now Hamas is in a situation where they will never agree to a peace agreement. It has to be with a different set. They have to be defeated, and then a different set of Palestinians have to come in. But we still do need a diplomatic outcome. There's no ultimate military outcome. You have to go through the military side. As Kissinger said, you have to win at the battlefield what you hope to achieve at the negotiating table, but there has to be a negotiating table.
It's essential but not sufficient.
Yes.
Exactly. Stu, thank you so much. Thank all of you. There will be a book signing outside in the Commons, and encourage you, patronize our author here. But thank you. Joe Biden's a mensch. Stu, so are you.
Thank you.